It was the final days of January, 1547. The sun that once rose proudly over the English Empire now cast only long, sickly shadows over the walls of Whitehall Palace. The candles in the king's chamber flickered nervously, as if they, too, feared what was about to happen. Henry VIII, once the Golden Prince of Europe, now lay bloated, immobile, and speechless, confined to his deathbed. His eyes, once piercing and charismatic, were sunken and glassy. His breath was shallow, wheezing in fits, accompanied by a low gurgle that filled the chamber like the death rattle of a man already halfway in the grave. He could barely move. He could no longer speak. But he was aware, and he was terrified. A thin sheen of sweat covered his massive body. Beneath the sheets, his leg ulcers had turned necrotic, blackened and oozing a stench so foul that even the closest attendants had to hold cloths to their noses. The room smelled of vinegar, burning herbs, and slow death. The doctors, helpless and grim-faced, stood by, administering tonics that did nothing but delay the inevitable. Henry, once surrounded by loyal wives, soldiers, and poets, now died alone, surrounded only by men paid to watch him rot. He knew what was coming. He feared it not for the pain, but for what waited after. He had ordered the deaths of thousands, burned men alive, dismembered traitors, executed wives, and now, with breath dwindling, he asked one quiet question: "Will God forgive me?" The room stayed silent. Not even the clergyman answered. In his final hours, those closest to the crown made themselves conveniently absent. The power brokers of the court, Thomas Wriothesley, Edward Seymour, Archbishop Cranmer, all waited nearby but not beside him. They hovered like vultures, not mourners, watching the seconds tick down on a reign soaked in blood. Everyone wanted his crown. No one wanted his stench. It was January 28, 1547, sometime between midnight and 2 a.m., when Henry VIII died. No fanfare, no royal trumpet, no massive mourners. Just the creaking of the chamber floor and the snuffing of a candle. The King of England, the once mighty, once godlike monarch, passed into death swollen, infected, and afraid. But the horror didn't end there. In fact, it was just beginning. According to reports, his corpse was so bloated and engorged that, as it lay in the coffin, it began to leak. The pressure inside his abdomen, filled with gas from decomposition, caused the body to rupture. Fluids, black, oily, and putrid, seeped through the casket and dripped onto the floor beneath. Here, history takes a turn into the surreal. One chronicler wrote that as the body was transported to Windsor for burial, the casket was left overnight in Sion Abbey, a place once sacred but desecrated by Henry's own hand during the dissolution of the monasteries. That night, dogs broke into the abbey and were seen licking the pooling liquid beneath his coffin, the very same kind of stray animals Henry had once called unclean scavengers, now fed off his remains. Irony does not scream louder than that. Clergy later tried to suppress the report, calling it heresy or exaggeration. But the symbolism could not be denied. This was the man who made himself head of the English Church, who defied Rome, who proclaimed divine rule, and yet, in the end, even the floor beneath him rejected his body. The funeral, too, was a grand contradiction. The greatest monarch in English history was buried in a rush. His massive corpse had to be forced into a lead-lined coffin. The tomb was unfinished. He was laid beside Jane Seymour, the only wife he claimed to truly love. And even that felt hollow. For she had died giving him a son, and that son, Edward VI, would rule only briefly before the line would crumble entirely. As Henry's body descended into the vault at St. George's Chapel in Windsor, bells tolled across England, but they rang not with grief, but with finality. It was not the end of a king. It was the end of an era. No one wept like they did for Elizabeth later. No one lined the streets. No poetry filled the air. There was only relief, tension, and the scramble for succession. His once unshakable empire trembled with uncertainty, but something else lingered. Something darker. In the years that followed, stories grew like mold on stone. Court whisperers claimed that Henry's ghost roamed Hampton Court, dragging his ulcerated leg across the floors, wailing for Anne Boleyn. Others swore they saw candles light themselves in the chapel where he was buried, only to be blown out by an unseen breath. One legend tells of a servant who heard pounding from inside Henry's tomb late one night. He fled and never returned. The king who could not be contained in life refused to be silent in death. Historians have debated his cause of death for centuries. Was it heart failure? Complications from untreated diabetes? Kidney failure? Sepsis from his ulcers? Or syphilis? But those are just clinical labels. What really killed Henry was something far more human and far more horrific. It was the weight of his sins. The empire he destroyed to build a dynasty. The wives he discarded. The friends he beheaded. The gods he betrayed. The fear he sowed. The paranoia he nurtured. The gluttony he indulged. The loneliness he created. It was the soul, not the body, that died first. And even now, more than 4 centuries later, his grave remains cold and anonymous, unmarked by any grand statue or holy relic. Just a simple slab above a vast vault. Quiet, forgotten, but never clean, for the ghosts of kings never sleep, especially those who die as monsters. In the end, Henry VIII's story is not just a tale of kings and conquests. It's a warning, a mirror, a question. What becomes of a man who has everything and still wants more? Henry began his reign as a radiant symbol of hope, a brilliant, athletic, handsome prince with music on his lips and scripture in his heart. But he ended it as a monstrous shadow of that promise, alone, diseased, feared, and spiritually hollow. The same hands that once danced in royal masks and signed love letters ended up signing death warrants and purging entire monasteries. Power didn't elevate Henry, it consumed him. And in the end, it broke him. Biographer David Starkey once wrote, "Henry was the only man who could look you in the eye and lie to your face while convincing himself that he spoke God's truth." That single line captures the terrifying duality of his life. He wasn't just cruel, he believed his cruelty was righteous. He didn't just chase legacy, he believed legacy was owed to him. But history, as it always does not forgive the self-declared gods. It judges them, not by their monuments, but by their humanity, or the loss of it. Henry's public image was grand, majestic, almost divine. His portraits were carefully constructed, broad shoulders, wide stance, powerful gaze. He was painted as unmovable, undefeatable. But behind the brushstrokes was a man deeply insecure, haunted by failure, obsessed with male heirs, and terrified of betrayal. He feared weakness more than he feared hell. So he killed anything that looked like doubt. 6 wives, 2 executed, thousands dead in his religious reforms, lifelong friends reduced to heads on spikes. Every crime committed, in his eyes, for the greater good. But what good came of it? His only legitimate son, Edward VI, died young. Mary, his Catholic daughter, turned England into a furnace of fire and executions. Elizabeth, the daughter he once rejected, ruled longest, but in doing so, she had to erase parts of his legacy to save England from it. So what exactly did Henry leave behind? Besides an empty tomb and a kingdom scarred by blood? He gave England the Church of England, yes, but at what cost? Monasteries burned, sacred texts lost, poor communities abandoned. He gave England a son, but only for a breath. He gave England strength, but not peace. In the end, Henry left England no roadmap, only a battlefield. And yet, even now, we remain obsessed with him. Books, films, museums, historians. We keep returning to the story of Henry VIII, not because he was great, but because he was so painfully human, flawed, ambitious, arrogant, hungry, brilliant, terrifying, he reminds us that even those who seem untouchable are still ruled by their bodies, their fears, their guilt. That kings still bleed. That monsters still cry. There's no amount of gold, no number of soldiers, no holy title that can protect a man from the decay of the soul, or the rot of the flesh, or the judgment of time. Perhaps that is why his story stays with us. Because deep down we recognize parts of ourselves in him, the pride, the mistakes, the need to be remembered, the fear of being forgotten, or worse, remembered only for the darkness. And so, we ask ourselves, is power worth the price of peace? Is legacy worth the loss of love? Historian G.J. Meyer once wrote, Henry was neither hero nor villain, but both, sometimes in the same breath. That paradox is what makes his story so enduring. He was a king, but also a cautionary tale, a builder and a destroyer. A man who created a nation, and almost destroyed himself in the process. In the echoing silence of St. George's Chapel, where Henry lies buried in anonymity, there is no statue, no epitaph, just stone, cold and quiet, as if even death itself refuses to remember him with glory. And maybe that is the most powerful legacy of all, not what he built, but what he lost. Not the empire, but the humanity. The injury never truly healed. It grew worse with time, developing into a painful open ulcer that would define the rest of his life. His mobility declined. The infection returned again and again. The once proud rider and hunter now limped painfully through his own palaces, the smell of rotting flesh beginning to fill the air before he entered a room. And that was only the beginning, because 1536 didn't just steal Henry's health, it broke his heart. That same year, he made a decision that still haunts the pages of history. He ordered the execution of Anne Boleyn, the woman he had once torn his country apart to marry. Just a few years earlier, he had defied the Pope himself to make Anne his queen. He had created the Church of England, shattered centuries of Catholic tradition, all for her. She was fiery, intelligent, and unlike any woman the court had seen before. She wasn't just a queen, she was a spark that set an empire ablaze. But Anne gave him another daughter, Elizabeth, and no son. And in Henry's mind, a woman on the throne was weakness, a curse. When Anne failed to produce a male heir, whispers began. Whispers of adultery, of witchcraft, of betrayal, and Henry listened. He didn't just remove her, he destroyed her. Anne Boleyn was arrested, tried on fabricated charges, and executed by sword on the 19th of May, 1536. Henry didn't even wait a day. He married Jane Seymour just 11 days later. The man who once wrote love songs now signed death warrants. The romantic king was gone. In his place stood a monarch willing to sacrifice any one wife, friend, servant for his vision of control. The betrayal wasn't only to Anne, it was to his own soul. And as his body grew weaker, his cruelty grew sharper. Those closest to him began to vanish. Thomas More, his beloved friend and Lord Chancellor, had once laughed beside him in court. But when More refused to support Henry's break from the Pope, he was beheaded. Henry called it justice. The world called it murder. The same fate met Thomas Cromwell, the very architect of Anne's rise and England's religious reformation. Once Henry's most trusted advisor, Cromwell was blamed for a failed marriage arrangement with Anne of Cleves. He was executed in 1540. By then, Henry's court had become a hall of whispers and shadows. Men flattered him to survive. Wives trembled in their chambers. His throne, once a place of Renaissance glory, now reeked of fear. But it was Henry's mind that began to betray him most. He became paranoid, convinced of plots, tormented by ghosts of decisions past. His mood swung violently from laughter to rage, The ulcer in his leg festered. It leaked pus and blood. It had to be lanced again and again, each time with fewer signs of healing. Doctors tried everything, leeches, poultices, heated irons, but the wound grew deeper, angrier. The man, who once danced with princesses, now screamed in agony behind velvet curtains. The irony was cruel. Henry had once broken away from the Catholic Church because he sought control over his marriage, his legacy, his future. But now, in his palace, he couldn't even control his own body, and the people knew. They whispered of his smell, of his madness, of his wives, 6 queens in total, 2 of whom he had executed. His charm had turned into a grim cautionary tale. His empire watched him age with a mix of pity and dread. But perhaps the greatest tragedy wasn't what Henry lost. It was what he became, the brilliant boy with golden hair, who once played music and read philosophy by candlelight, had become a bloated tyrant wrapped in silks, dragging a leg full of rot and drowning in regret. Every drop of blood spilled in pursuit of a male heir had only birthed more ghosts, and still, no son strong enough to replace him. His only surviving son, Edward, was sickly. His daughter Mary was Catholic. His daughter Elizabeth was born of the wife he had beheaded. His legacy was no longer a triumph. It was a contradiction. The king who defied a pope for love had executed that love. The monarch who unified church and state had divided his nation. The warrior who once rode in shining armor was now wheeled across stone floors like a broken relic. And, worse still, he knew it. He knew the end was coming. The court around him grew colder. Nobles smiled, but feared his wrath. Servants obeyed, but gagged behind doors. The perfume grew heavier. The windows stayed open, even in winter. His ulcer, now possibly infected with gangrene, no longer just hurt, it oozed. It rotted. He couldn't walk more than a few steps without help. He couldn't sleep without screams. He couldn't eat without pain. This, then, was the turning point, not a single moment, but a slow uncoiling of a man who once seemed godlike. Henry VIII didn't fall off a cliff. He dissolved. Piece by piece, decision by decision, scream by scream, and as the crown pressed heavier on his rotting head, the nation waited for his final breath, for the end of an era, and for the reckoning to come. The mighty Henry VIII, once the embodiment of English strength, beauty, and divine kingship, had now become something unrecognizable, even to those who once worshipped him. His glorious armor, once tailored for a lean and athletic prince, now gathered dust in the corridors of memory, unable to fit his grotesquely swollen body. The king had not just grown older. He had decayed, alive, and everyone in court, from servant to noble, could smell it. By the time Henry reached his final years, his body was a battlefield of rotting flesh, pus-filled ulcers, and grotesque obesity. He weighed nearly 400 pounds. His legs were so swollen that he could barely stand, and his grotesque ulcers emitted a stench that forced even loyal courtiers to turn their faces away in silent horror. His once powerful stride had turned into a shuffle, a wheezing, painful drag. He rarely left his chambers. Once the Lion of England, he now lived like a trapped animal, wounded, isolated, and terrifying. The light that once filled the great halls of Whitehall dimmed. Tapestries hung heavier. The air in Henry's quarters was thick with the scent of rot, sweat, and despair. Doctors came and went with leeches, poultices, and prayers, all useless. They lanced his leg ulcers daily, but the pus would return, yellow and hot. Sometimes, the infection would bubble up with such pressure that it burst through the bandages, spraying the walls, the floor, even the faces of those kneeling beside him. They called it the wound that never closed. But some whispered it was something more. Some said it was divine punishment for the beheadings, the betrayal of wives, the murders cloaked in law. Henry's physical pain was matched only by his mental torment. He raved in the night, haunted by the ghosts of the 6 wives who had shared his bed, and the thousands of souls who had died under his orders. His court fell silent during these episodes. No one dared interrupt when the king screamed in his sleep, calling out the names of Anne Boleyn or Jane Seymour, as if they hovered above his bed, watching him rot. He had no heir strong enough to carry his name, no legacy untouched by blood, no peace. The grand king who had built a church to break from the Pope now trembled in fear of his own damnation. Clergymen came to his chambers, reading scriptures aloud to calm him, but even they could not drown out the sound of his own guilt screaming back from the walls. He asked them if his sins could be washed away. They gave him holy water. He wept. Meals, once his great joy, had turned into grotesque feasts. He devoured pounds of meat, drowning it in wine, his hands greasy, his beard stained. Servants stood silently as he choked, chewed, and gurgled his way through courses. Food was the only pleasure left to him, and even that came with pain. His teeth had rotted, his breath was fetid. Sometimes he vomited mid-meal, only to begin again, no longer fit in his own armor. A mechanical lift was installed to carry him up and down stairs. It creaked and groaned under his weight. Every step Henry took now echoed not with power, but with agony. His legs bled, his heart strained, his skin bruised with the lightest touch. People began to avoid him. Even his most loyal counselors found excuses to leave court. Ambassadors whispered of a mad king, a dying beast thrashing in a golden cage. Henry no longer trusted anyone. He would sit for hours in silence, clutching a dagger in his sweaty hand, staring at the door, waiting for betrayal, expecting it. He changed his will frequently, executed those closest to him. Mistrust had eaten his soul. No man, no woman, not even his own children, could be near him without fear. His court became a funeral procession. Silent, dreadful, endless. And yet he lived. Through all of it, the infections, the fevers, the screaming, he survived. Doctors wondered how. Some said it was sheer will. Others whispered darker things, that the devil kept him alive to witness every moment of his torment. That hell itself was delayed, because watching him rot on earth was more satisfying. By 1546, Henry had become a legend in reverse. A man who once ruled Europe now needed servants to wipe him after relieving himself. He had no dignity. And yet, he was still the king. Every noble, every lord, every knight still bowed, even as they smelled his body dying. But there was no more fear in their eyes, only pity. That was the final curse of Henry's life. Not the leg ulcers, not the endless pain, not the ghosts or dreams, but pity. The great King of England, once feared by Rome, loved by poets, and obeyed by empires, was now pitied, and he knew it, and that broke him. It was the dead of night, and the royal palace reeked of something no one dared name. Behind the thick velvet curtains of his chamber, King Henry VIII lay slumped on a bed too grand for the man he had become. His once mighty body had turned into a prison of rotting flesh, open sores, and unrelenting screams. Servants who used to kneel in awe now entered only when forced, and even then, they covered their faces to shield themselves from the stench of decay. His legs, swollen and blackened, oozed pus that soaked through layers of royal linens. The ulcer on his thigh, once a simple wound, had grown monstrous, wide open, leaking and foul. The king could barely move, and when he did, the pain echoed off the marble walls like a curse. Doctors stood helpless, muttering prayers instead of remedies, their herbs and potions no match for the slow, agonizing rot consuming England's most powerful man. And yet, Henry still ruled, with a crown heavy on his head and death lurking beneath his skin. He issued commands that echoed with madness. Sometimes he shouted in terror at people who weren't there. Other times he whispered names no one recognized, like he was speaking to ghosts. He had started seeing things. Hearing voices, faces in the dark. Was it guilt, punishment, or something far worse? The courtiers feared his wrath, but feared his presence even more. Some claimed his rooms were haunted, not by spirits from the past, but by the living ghost that Henry had become. Once the Lion of England, he was now an emperor of shadows, ruling from a bed soaked in blood and regret. At night, the walls wept. Candlelight flickered against damp stone, casting dancing shadows that looked almost human. And in the dead silence, when even the mice refused to scurry, there came a sound, a groan so deep and twisted, it didn't sound human. It was the king, lost between worlds, rotting alive but still clutching power. His servants wept in secret. Some claimed the smell alone could drive a man mad. Others whispered that the devil had finally come to claim him. God has turned his face from the king, one old nurse muttered, trembling, and left the angels behind to watch him burn slowly. Physicians feared touching him. He had grown monstrous in every way. His body, bloated and grotesque, no longer looked human. His eyes sunken, lips cracked, and beard matted with sweat. His flesh was tearing from the inside, his mind dissolving into nightmares. But still, he breathed. He ruled. This was not the death of a man. This was a slow, spiritual execution. For those who had known the young, vibrant Henry, charming, athletic, golden-haired, this transformation was more than terrifying. It was as if time had twisted itself into a punishment, turning beauty into horror, strength into weakness, power into rot. And yet, no one dared speak of it openly. The halls of Whitehall were silent now. The music was gone, the laughter gone. The great king still breathing, but no longer alive in any way that mattered. Only his throne remained polished. Only his portraits remained beautiful. The real man, the rotting, groaning, haunted shell in the dark, was the secret England couldn't speak of, yet couldn't escape, because what really killed Henry VIII wasn't a sword or poison or a traitor's knife. It was something slower, something darker. And it started long before he died, long before the stench of rot filled his royal bedchambers. Henry VIII was the Golden Prince of England, the embodiment of charm, power, and hope. In his youth, the kingdom didn't fear him. They adored him. He was born on June 28, 1491, the second son of King Henry VII and Elizabeth of York. His birth united the feuding houses of Lancaster and York, ending decades of civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. He wasn't just a child of royalty, he was the living symbol of peace. His bloodline merged two enemy dynasties, and with it came the pressure of perfection. But young Henry wasn't meant to be king. That role belonged to his older brother, Arthur. So while Arthur was trained in the arts of statecraft and governance, Henry was allowed to grow up a little freer, more curious, more passionate, more human. He was a marvel to look at. Athletic, broad-shouldered, tall for his time. His red gold hair shimmered like fire in sunlight. He rode horses like he was born in the saddle, danced with elegance, and spoke fluent Latin, French, and Spanish. He could quote theology and then crush a joust all in the same day. He was the Renaissance prince of every bard's dream. He wasn't raised to wear the crown, but he looked like he was born with it. Then tragedy struck. In 1502, Arthur died suddenly, possibly from the sweating sickness. At just 11 years old, Henry was now heir to the English throne. The carefree boy was pulled into the shadows of duty and destiny. His world became smaller, colder. His father, a frugal and cautious king, grew more watchful of him. Henry was no longer just a boy. He was a future ruler and a tool of the monarchy. When King Henry VII died in 1509, 17-year-old Henry became King of England, and the transformation was explosive. Almost overnight, the dull, joyless court of his father erupted into color and pageantry. Henry VIII ascended the throne like a sun rising after a long gray winter. His coronation was dazzling. The people cheered, not just for their new king, but for the idea of a rebirth he carried. He wasn't just a ruler. He was a fantasy made flesh. He married his brother's widow, Catherine of Aragon, to secure the alliance with Spain and satisfy religious doctrine. But unlike most political marriages, this one began with genuine affection. Henry called her the Queen of Earthly. Queens, they shared laughter, music, and dreams of children. For a time it seemed Henry had it all: love, power, youth, and glory. But Henry didn't just want to rule. He wanted to be legendary. He poured gold into tournaments, pageants, and grand spectacles. The court became a theater of grandeur. His armor was gilded. His feasts were legendary. Foreign ambassadors described him as the handsomest prince in Christendom. And not just in appearance. His mind was sharp, his charisma magnetic. He wrote music. He debated religion with scholars. He even published theological defenses against Martin Luther, earning him the title Defender of the Faith from the published Pope. He was a king people wanted to love. A king who wanted to be loved. But behind the pageantry, a restlessness brewed. His marriage to Catherine, once filled with affection, grew strained. Their union produced no surviving sons. Only one daughter, Mary. And in Henry's mind, a king without a male heir was a king whose legacy would crumble. This obsession with legacy, this fear of being forgotten, would haunt him for life. Still, during his early reign, the mask of greatness held firm. His court overflowed with thinkers, poets, musicians, and architects. He built libraries. He promoted learning. He was a true Renaissance king. And for a moment, England shimmered under his rule like a kingdom from legend. He knew how to hold a crowd, how to play the hero. In tournaments, he'd ride with his visor down and then reveal himself after winning, letting the cheers erupt at the surprise. He choreographed his own myth with brilliance. He understood the power of image before modern media even existed. But that image came at a cost. The pressure to be glorious, to be eternal, began to twist something inside him. As the years passed and no male heir came, Henry's fear grew darker. His decisions became sharper, more impulsive. He couldn't control life, so he sought to control fate. What began as noble ambition slowly turned to obsession. Still, in those early decades, it was hard not to be dazzled by him. He wasn't just feared, he was admired. England's enemies took him seriously. Its people adored him. Its artists immortalized him. But greatness has a shadow. And for Henry, that shadow was already creeping in. Beneath the layers of velvet and gold, beneath the music and games, a rot had begun to take hold, not in his body yet, but in his spirit. The charming prince who had been crowned with laughter would one day fill his palace with screams, because Henry VIII wasn't born a tyrant. He became one. Slowly, tragically, and in plain sight. What killed him didn't come from outside. It was already there deep inside the boy with the crown. Long before the world saw the monster, the fall of Henry VIII didn't begin with a sword, a rebellion, or a betrayal in the dark. It began with something far more ordinary, yet infinitely more destructive. Henry was no longer the golden prince of England. The athletic warrior, the jousting champion, the charming poet king had begun to change. His hair thinned. His waist thickened. His temper shortened. But none of it struck as hard or as fatally as what came on the 24th of January, 1536. It was a day like many others. A jousting tournament was underway at Greenwich Palace. Henry, at 44 years old, was still eager to show strength, to prove to his court and to himself that he was the same vigorous monarch who once dazzled Europe. But age had crept into his bones, and worse into his judgment. He mounted his horse and prepared to charge. But this time, there would be no cheering finish, no poetic reveal. The moment he charged forward, something went wrong. His horse, armored and massive, struck violently. Henry was thrown off and slammed into the earth with a force that silenced the arena. His full weight, wrapped in steel, crashed onto the ground like a felled statue. He was unconscious for 2 hours. 2 hours, for that length of time, his heart may have stopped. His brain may have gone without oxygen. The records remain blurred, but something changed in Henry from that day forward. His leg was crushed. His spirit even more so.